One of the biggest takeaways I have from this year has been the importance of stories for us as human beings. I grew up thinking that as a kids we believed in stories, but that grown-ups entered the real world where they no longer were governed by stories, but by facts, by truth. And what I've learned to accept, and that is true now, is that we never give up stories, that we exchange maybe our children's stories for adult stories, stories that we as adults have called truth, or we say matter more, or we call real, but they're still stories. And this last year has taught me, particularly as I've watched people that disagree with each other around politics, around COVID-19, around election results, around so many things, is that one side is saying to the other, how could you possibly believe these stories that aren't true? And the other side is saying, well, how could you possibly believe these stories that are not true? And part of the problem is that we all think as grown-ups that what we believe isn't a story. And I want to point out that I believe in facts and in science and empirical evidence. All those things matter, but as a species or as human beings, we are more driven by stories than we are by those facts, that evidence, that science. And so it is so important for us to just claim that. Whether we do it begrudgingly or we don't wish it was true, we are not a species that is based on facts. We are a species that's based on stories. I don't know how to explain that evolutionarily, but I do believe as a person of faith that God made us to be storied people and made us to be storytellers. Everything in the world that we value has something to do with stories. So the right question, I think, for us is not how do we get people to stop believing in those stories that aren't true and to believe in the facts and the truth. I think a better question is how do we tell a better story? How do we tell stories that will lead us to become our best selves? And as a person of faith, what this has made me think of is that it is okay to claim that Christianity, in my case, is a story. It's a story. It's a great story. And calling it a story doesn't diminish it at all. Because if we believe that God created us to be storied people that are driven by stories and are storytellers, then it's okay to claim that our faith story is a story. To not have to call it facts, to not have to call it truth, or to be afraid of calling it myth, because myth, by the way, often just means a story. We're storied people. And I think we really need to be concerned with what stories we're believing. And I think part of why we are where we are is the Enlightenment, which has been an experiment for hundreds of years in which we've tried to convince each other of rationality and truth, and that we are people who are driven by reason and not by stories and myths. I think part of that is an overcorrection of not recognizing how storied we really are. And so now we continue to be storied people. We continue to be shaped and driven by stories, but we're in denial about it. And no one wants to claim that stories are actually what's driving us as communities and individuals. And so I think that's a problem. I think the first thing we should do, particularly as Christians, accept that Christianity is a story, accept that we need stories to thrive, that we need grand sweeping stories that hold both our personal needs and our global and cosmic needs. Accept that the stories we choose matter. And I think for me as a follower of Jesus, accept that it is God who is helping me see a fuller story, and that in that journey, my story will change. That I don't need to have rigid thinking around my stories, but that I'm actually living my life in this world in the midst of a story that is unfolding, a drama that is progressing, and that I get to be a part of that with you. What if we could do that? Would that help?